Holding a chocolate Yule log cake at the supermarket, I excitedly called my son to ask about tonight's Christmas party. He muttered flatly, "We already celebrated yesterday." My daughter-in-law cut in, "We feel so much lighter without you. Don't come tonight." I hung up, took the cake, and walked out of the store. On my way home, I happened to shelter a freezing mother and son trapped in a dead van. 2 hours later, my son's house plunged into darkness while my phone began buzzing non-stop. I'm so grateful you're here with me today on Silent Revenge with Auntie May. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching? From your city, your state, your country. I want to know. This story draws from fictional elements for entertainment and reflection, but the lesson it carries, that part is yours to keep. The Christmas Eve snow started falling over Bend, Oregon, right around the time most people were heading home to warm kitchens and wrapped presents. I was standing in the baking aisle of Ridley's Market, holding a chocolate Yule log cake in both hands, trying to decide if Tyler preferred the one with the powdered sugar dusting or the one with the little marzipan mushrooms on top. 26 years of Christmases and I still second-guessed the cake. My name is Hazel Briggs. I am 63 years old, and for the past 26 years, I have run Hazel's Yard and Snow Service out of a 2-truck operation on the east side of Bend. Summers, I cut grass and trim hedges for about 40 regular clients. Winters, I plow driveways and clear parking lots from 3 in the morning until the roads are passable. My hands are calloused from the cold and the steering wheel. My work jacket smells like diesel and rock salt. I have never once been ashamed of either of those things. I pulled out my phone and called Tyler. It rang 4 times. When he picked up, I could hear voices in the background, laughter, the particular clinking sound of good dishes being set on a table. "Hey, Mom." His voice had that flatness to it, the tone he used when I called at an inconvenient time, which had become somewhere in the last few years, most times. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm at Ridley's picking up the cake. Do you want the one with the marzipan decorations or just the plain powdered sugar? I know Chloe has opinions about—" "Mom." He cut me off, and something in the single syllable made my chest tighten. "We already did our thing last night." My hand gripped the cake box harder than I meant to. The cardboard bent slightly at the corner. "Last night." My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "But I thought Tyler we talked about tonight. I've been planning—" There was a shuffling sound like the phone being passed between hands. Then a voice I knew too well cut through the noise of the party behind it. "Hazel." Chloe's voice was bright and clipped the tone she used when she wanted to sound pleasant while saying something that wasn't. "I'm going to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty. We feel so much lighter when it's just us. Your work jacket, the smell it carries, the way you come in straight from the truck, our guests notice, and it makes things uncomfortable. We finished our celebration last night. Please don't come over tonight." The line went dead. I stood in the baking aisle of Ridley's Market with a $22 chocolate Yule log cake in my hands and the sound of my daughter-in-law's voice echoing somewhere behind my sternum like a stone dropped into still water. A woman pushing a cart full of eggnog and dinner rolls glanced at me, then looked away quickly. I must have looked like someone had just slapped me. I walked to the register. I paid for the cake. I said Merry Christmas to the teenager behind the counter because she had nothing to do with any of this, and she smiled and set it back, and I carried the cake out into the snow. Sitting in the cab of my truck, I set the box on the passenger seat and stared at the windshield as the snow built up on the glass in soft layers. 26 years ago, on the worst night of my life, my husband Dennis squeezed my hand in the hospital hallway and told me Tyler was going to be okay. 2 hours later, Dennis was gone. A heart attack so fast the doctor said he likely felt nothing. Tyler was 6 years old. I was 37, and I made a decision somewhere in the fog of that grief that I was going to keep showing up. For Tyler. For everything Tyler needed, no matter what it cost me. I looked at the passenger seat. Dennis used to sit there. Every Christmas Eve, run to Ridley's. He'd hold his coffee thermos between his knees and talk the whole way about nothing important, the neighbor's lights, a song on the radio, some story from work. He had this way of filling silence that I only understood the value of after it was gone forever. His voice had faded enough now that I couldn't always hear it clearly in my memory. But one thing stayed sharp. Hayes! He'd said it on one of the last good nights, his hand warm on the back of my neck. Whatever happens, just keep showing up. That's the whole job. Just keep showing up. I had done that. For 26 years, I had done exactly that. My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my hand against them hard the way you do when you refuse to cry in a parking lot on Christmas Eve. Showing up for who? The heat in the truck cab ticked on. Outside, the snow thickened. The parking lot was emptying out as families headed home. That's when I heard it barely audible through the truck's insulation and the wind. A child's voice, coming from the far end of the lot. I wiped my eyes, sat up straight, and looked through the snow-blurred passenger window. At the edge of the parking lot, half hidden in the shadow between two streetlights, sat an old cargo van with its side door cracked open a few inches. Not the way a door gets left open by accident. The way a door gets left open by someone who needs air but can't afford to run the heat. I have pulled people out of ditches in January blizzards. I have jumped dead batteries in parking lots at 5 in the morning when the temperature was 9 degrees and nobody else was coming. 26 years of running a service business in a mountain town teaches you that when something looks wrong, you don't sit in your warm truck and wait to see if it gets worse. I grabbed my work gloves off the dashboard and stepped out into the snow. The van was a white Chevy Express older model, the kind of vehicle that used to be a plumber's truck or a flower delivery van before somebody bought it cheap and stripped it out. The logo on the side had been painted over, but not well. You could still see the ghost of lettering underneath in certain light. The side door was open, maybe 4 inches. I could see a small pair of sneakers through the gap. The soles were worn through at the toe. I knocked on the side panel. 3 short raps the way you knock on a door when you don't want to startle anyone. The door slid open. The woman inside looked at me the way people look at strangers who approach them in parking lots, careful, measuring, deciding in about 2 seconds whether this was safe. She was younger than me, by a good stretch. Dark hair pulled back, wearing a canvas work jacket with an HVAC certification patch on the left shoulder. Her eyes were steady. Whatever was happening to her, she wasn't panicking. "I'm not in trouble," she said immediately. "The battery died. Cold got to it. I've called 3 roadside services, and nobody's picking up on Christmas Eve." "That's going to be a long wait," I said. "Every tow company in Deschutes County is slammed right now. How long have you been out here?" "Hour and 40 minutes. Sitting in the back seat, bundled in a puffy orange coat that was slightly too big for him, was a boy of about 9. He had his arms wrapped around a backpack in his lap like it was the most important thing he owned. He looked at me with the particular caution of a child who had learned that adults showing up unexpectedly didn't always mean good things were coming. "What's your name?" I asked him directly, because children deserve to be spoken to, not spoken around. He glanced at his mother. She gave him a small nod. "Leo," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. I reached back into my truck and picked up the cake box from the passenger seat. The chocolate Yule log cake I'd bought for a table that didn't want me. I held it out toward him. Leo looked at the box. Then he looked up at me with those careful eyes, and he asked a question that hit me somewhere below the ribs and stayed there. "Is this really for us? Not can I have some? Not thank you. But is this real? Is this the kind of thing that actually happens?" He wasn't being rude. He was being honest in the way that children are honest when nobody has taught them yet to pretend they're not surprised by kindness. My throat pulled tight. I kept my voice even. "It is," I said. "Every last bit of it." He took the box with both hands carefully like it might disappear if he grabbed too fast. I straightened up and looked at the mother. "I've got jumper cables and a spare battery in the truck bed. We can try a jump first, but if the battery's gone, it's gone. Either way, you're not sitting out here in this." I nodded toward the passenger door of my truck. "Come on, both of you." She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "I'm Elena Vasquez. Hazel Briggs." I put out my hand and she shook it firm. No hesitation, the handshake of someone who worked with their hands for a living. "Let's get Leo warm first and then deal with the van." We tried the jump. The battery was gone past saving too far, drained by the cold to take a charge. I told Elena we'd get it jumped properly in the morning. Ray had the equipment at his place. In the cab of the truck, Leo sat in the back seat with the cake box on his lap. He didn't open it. He just held it. I watched him in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the lot, and I saw him look out the window at the snow-covered storefronts and the Christmas lights strung between the lampposts, and something in his small face, eased like a breath he'd been holding for a long time, finally let go. Elena sat in the passenger seat, the same seat where Dennis used to ride. She looked straight ahead at the road and spoke in the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a report, not asking for sympathy. "I'm an HVAC tech," she said. "Oregon contractor's license current. I've been in the trade 11 years. I relocated from Portland 8 months ago." She paused. The marriage ended. Leo and I needed a fresh start. I've got leads on 2 service companies in Bend, but nothing signed yet. You know, forced air systems, heat pumps, better than most people who've been doing it twice as long. No arrogance in it, just fact. I turned onto my street, and the porch light of my house came into view through the snow, that steady amber glow I always left on when I went out, the habit of a woman who had lived alone long enough to know that coming home to a dark house sat wrong in the chest. Leo leaned forward between the seats and looked at the light. "Is that your house?" he asked. "It is." He looked at it for a long moment, this boy with worn-through sneakers and a cake box held like treasure. Then he sat back in his seat and said very quietly, "It looks warm." 2 words, but my heart squeezed around them like a fist. I pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. I had 6 equipment contracts to service before morning and a storage shed I'd been putting off dealing with for weeks. I looked over at Elena. "I've got something I need to take care of before the storm gets worse," I said. "You know anything about generator wiring?" She turned and looked at me with those steady eyes. "Tell me what you need." Leo looked up from the cake box when I came back inside with an extra pair of dry socks from the mudroom closet. "You can leave your sneakers by the heater," I told him. "They'll be dry by the time we get back." He looked down at his shoes, the worn-through toes, the wet laces, and his cheeks went pink, the way a child's cheeks go when they're embarrassed about something they can't help. He pulled them off without another word and set them carefully side by side on the mat like he was a guest who wanted to cause the least possible inconvenience. That boy had been taught to make himself small. The thought sat in my chest like a coal. Elena was already in her jacket. "Where are we going?" "Storage shed on the north side of town. I've got a 10,000-watt generator I need pulled out before this storm gets worse. It's due for winter service, and I've been putting it off." I took my keys off the hook by the door. I built the shed last year to stage equipment. It's on a property my son uses, but the padlock has always had my key. I never signed that building over, never filed the transfer. Elena's expression didn't change, but she gave a single nod that told me she understood exactly what I was and wasn't saying. We left Leo on the couch with the cake box, a glass of milk, and strict instructions not to open the front door for anyone. "What if you don't come back?" he asked, and the question was so plainly practical, not dramatic, just a child running through contingencies, that it squeezed something behind my eyes. "We'll be back in an hour," Elena told him firmly. "Lock the deadbolt after us. You know how." He did. We heard the bolt slide home before we reached the truck. The drive across town took longer than usual. The snow had thickened into something serious, the kind of heavy, wet fall that bends pine branches and kills power lines. I drove the route I'd driven 1,000 times in worse conditions, both hands on the wheel, the truck's weight steady under me. "How long have you had the service company?" Elena asked. 26 years. Started with 1 truck and a push mower." I slowed for a stop sign buried under a drift. "My husband died 6 months after I got the first commercial contract. I almost quit. Instead, I bought a second truck." Elena turned to look at me. Good call. Only call I had. The shed sat at the edge of the property, a solid structure 12 by 20 metal roof, the kind of thing built to last because I'd built it myself with Ray's help over one long August weekend. I unlocked the padlock with my key and pulled the door open. The smell of cold metal and stored equipment rolled out familiar as my own kitchen. Elena stepped in ahead of me and swept her flashlight across the space. The generator sat in the far corner, a commercial-grade Generac orange and substantial. She moved toward it with the focused efficiency of someone who had been reading equipment in low light for years. Then she stopped. "Mrs. Briggs." Her voice had shifted professional, careful. "Come look at this." I came up beside her. She aimed the flashlight at the rear panel of the generator where the standard output connections were. Running off the left terminal, somebody had attached an additional wire heavier gauge than the original setup, zip-tied along the baseboard and disappearing through a hole drilled into the shared wall with the garage. "That wire wasn't installed by whoever set this unit up originally," Elena said. She crouched down, traced it with 2 fingers without touching. "Someone ran it separately. Recently, the zip ties are still bright white, and it's not grounded correctly." She stood up and her jaw was tight. "That is a fire hazard, Mrs. Briggs. If this generator runs under load with that connection in place, you're looking at a serious risk." My back teeth pressed together. The garage on the other side of that wall belonged to Tyler's house. "Can you disconnect it safely?" I asked. "That's exactly what I'm about to do." She unzipped her tool roll, the one she'd grabbed from the van before we left and got to work. Clean, precise, no wasted motion. She snipped the unauthorized wire at both ends, capped the terminals, and checked the original connections twice before she stood up. "Done. Generator's clean now." We loaded the Generac into the truck bed together. It was heavy enough that we both had to lean into it, boots slipping on the icy ground breath, coming out in white bursts. Neither of us complained. Along the inside wall, I spotted 6 paper bags of ice melt with my company logo stenciled on the sides. I'd left them here in October, thinking Tyler might spread them on the driveway approaches before the first hard freeze. Clearly, that hadn't happened. I loaded all 6 bags into the truck without comment. They were mine. I needed them for the service runs tonight. When I pulled the shed door shut and snapped the padlock closed, I let myself glance once toward the house. The lights were on inside. I could hear faintly the sound of music from what was probably a Bluetooth speaker. Through the front window, I could see the silhouette of Sharon Harmon, Chloe's mother, moving toward the front door with something large and flat balanced in both hands. A roasting pan, maybe, or a serving tray. The porch steps were glazed with a thin skin of ice, smooth as glass. Not a single grain of ice melt on them. My stomach dropped. "Let's go," I said. I reversed out of the driveway and got us back on the main road. We were 2 blocks away when I heard it, a sound like a branch, giving way under snow load, a sharp crack that echoed off the houses. Then in my rearview mirror, the streetlights behind us flickered once and went dark. The whole block behind us black, including every window in Tyler's house. Elena looked in the side mirror. Then she looked at me. I kept my eyes on the road and pressed the accelerator. Leo had unlocked the deadbolt before I even got my key out. He pulled the door open with both hands and stood there in his socked feet, eyes scanning from me to Elena and back again with an expression of barely contained relief that he was trying very hard to make look casual. "You said an hour," he said. "We said an hour." Elena confirmed, stepping in and pulling the door shut behind her. She put her hand on the back of his head for just a moment. Quick, warm, the kind of touch that said, "I know you were worried, and I'm sorry, and we're here now all at once." Leo leaned into it for exactly 1 second before straightening up like it hadn't happened. I was hanging my jacket on the hook by the door when I heard Ray's knock. 15 years of living 3 houses down the street, and Raymond Kowalski had never once knocked more than twice. 1 firm knock, 1 follow-up that was his signature. If you didn't answer in 30 seconds, he assumed you were dead or busy, and he came back later. I'd come to think of that knock the way you think of a particular bird song, something that meant a specific, reliable thing. I opened the door. Ray was 67 years old, a retired mechanic with hands like catcher's mitts and a face that had been weathered by 40 Oregon winters into something that looked carved rather than grown. He was holding a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel. He looked at me, then past me at Elena and Leo, and his expression did the thing it always did when Ray was processing something unexpected: a slight tightening around the eyes, a microscopic pause, and then total acceptance. "Got sweet potato casserole," he said. "Made too much." Ray had lived alone since Carol passed 3 years ago. He never made too much of anything by accident. "Come in," I said. He set the casserole on the stove and sat down in the chair at the end of my kitchen table, the same chair he'd sat in every time he'd come over for the past decade. Leo watched him with open curiosity, the way children watch adults they haven't categorized yet. "Ray Kowalski," he said, extending one of those enormous hands across the table toward Leo. "I fix things." Leo shook it very seriously. "Leo Vasquez. I'm 9. "Good age," Ray said, as if this were meaningful data. He looked at me then, and his expression shifted just slightly, that carved face, finding its way to something that wasn't quite comfortable. He had something to say. He'd been working up to it since he walked in. "I saw what happened over at Tyler's," he said. My hands went still on the counter. "Tell me." Sharon came out the front door right around 5:15. Carrying a roasting pan, looked heavy, both hands full. "The porch steps." He shook his head slowly. "She hit that ice and went down hard, Hazel. Pan went one direction, woman went the other. She's all right, she's fine, just shook up and mad as a wet cat. But the pan—" He exhaled. "Whatever was in it is in the snow now." I thought about 6 bags of ice melt sitting in my truck bed. I thought about the porch steps I'd seen through the shed window, glazed over and untreated. I had not put that ice on those steps, but I had been the one in previous years who always had. I didn't say any of that. I just nodded. "There's something else," Ray said. Elena quietly steered Leo toward the living room. "Hey, can you show me how that old radio works? The one on the shelf." Leo looked between the adults, reading the room with that particular radar that kids develop when they've spent time around conversations they weren't supposed to hear. He went with Elena without argument. Ray waited until they were out of earshot. "Chloe was at the wholesale grocery about 20 minutes ago," he said. "Linda Perkins was there picking up ginger ale for her mother, and she called me right after. Said Chloe rolled up with a cart full of replacement food, must have been $300–400 worth. Went to check out." He paused for effect because Ray had a mechanic's instinct for timing. Card declined. Tried it twice. Left the whole cart at the register and walked out. The account had a monthly spending limit I'd set when I added her. She must have hit it. Something unlocked behind my ribs. I crossed to the counter where I'd left my purse and unzipped the inner pocket. My wallet, my cards. I pulled out the secondary card ledger I kept folded behind my license, the one where I tracked the authorized users on my main account. Chloe Harmon Briggs. Added January of this year. For grocery runs, I'd told myself. To make things easier. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on the back of the card. The customer service line picked up on the second ring. "I need to remove an authorized user from my account," I said. "Effective immediately. The name is Chloe Briggs." I gave them my account number, my security, PIN, my mother's maiden name, the whole verification chain. I understand the card may already be inactive due to a declined transaction. I want the user access fully removed from the account, not just the card frozen. "I can process that right now, Ms. Briggs," the representative said. "Done. The authorized user has been removed. Is there anything else?" "No," I said. "That's everything. Thank you." I hung up and set the phone down on the counter. Ray was watching me with the expression of a man who had seen a lot of things get fixed and knew what the moment looked like when the right tool finally got applied to the right problem. "That card's been on my account since January," I said. It wasn't an explanation. It was just a fact that needed to be said out loud once before I could let it go. "Yep," Ray said. From the living room came the sound of Leo laughing, sudden, unguarded, the laugh of a child who had forgotten for a moment that he was supposed to be careful. Elena must have done something with the old radio. I didn't know what. I didn't need to know. I stood in my kitchen and listened to that laugh fill up the room, and for the first time all day, the tightness in my chest loosened by a fraction. Then Ray tilted his head toward the living room and said very quietly, "You going to tell me who they are?" "Later," I said. "Right now I think your casserole needs to go in the oven." He nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer, which with Ray it was. I had just put the casserole into warm when I noticed something flicker at the edge of my vision. Leo was standing in the kitchen doorway holding out a small piece of paper. "I think this fell out of your coat pocket," he said. "It was on the floor by the door." A receipt, gas station purchase from 2 days ago, printed at the top in black ink the way all my receipts printed, Hazel R. Briggs account holder. I took the receipt from his hand, stared at it. Thought about Chloe at the wholesale grocery cart-loaded card in hand. The authorized user form had printed the full account holder name on every transaction record, which meant every receipt Chloe had ever generated on that card had my full name printed across the top. I had just called the bank. But something told me that decline transaction had already done its own particular work. Ray heard it before I did. He was spooning casserole onto plates when he stopped and tilted his head toward the hallway, the way an old mechanic tilts his head toward an engine that's making a sound it shouldn't. "Your furnace," he said. I listened. Underneath the normal hum of the heating system, there was a faint, rhythmic clicking, regular like a lighter that almost catches but doesn't quite commit. I'd been hearing it since morning without really hearing it the way you stop noticing a drip until someone else points it out. Elena was already moving down the hallway toward the utility closet before I finished turning around. "Wait," I said. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she called back. "Leo, hand me my tool bag." Leo scrambled off the couch and dragged Elena's canvas tool bag from beside the front door he'd apparently memorized where she put it the moment we walked in, the same way children memorize the location of the things most important to the adults they depend on. He carried it down the hall with both hands and presented it to his mother like a surgical nurse passing instruments. "Thank you, baby," Elena said, unzipping it on the floor. "What's wrong with it?" Leo asked, crouching beside her. "Igniter's probably fouled. Maybe the inducer. I won't know until I open it up." She pulled out a flashlight and a flathead and looked up at me. "You mind if I take the panel off?" "Do whatever you need to," I said. Ray leaned against the hallway wall, arms crossed, watching Elena work with the particular appreciation of one tradesperson watching another. She moved through the diagnostic the way experienced hands always move, without hesitation, without performance, just clean purpose. She found the cracked igniter in under 4 minutes. "There it is," she said, holding the component up in the flashlight beam. "Hairline fracture. It's been misfiring intermittently. You probably noticed the heat cycling on and off." She looked at me. "I thought it was just the cold," I admitted. "It'll fail completely in the next day or 2. She was already unzipping the side pocket of her tool bag. "I carry replacement igniters for the 3 most common residential furnace models. Odds were decent you'd have one of them." She pulled out a small cardboard box, checked the part number against the furnace plate, and smiled, quick satisfied. "You do." She had the new igniter seated and calibrated in 11 minutes. When the furnace kicked on, full, clean, steady, the heat rolled through the vents like a held breath, finally released. Leo put both palms flat on the nearest floor register and grinned up at the ceiling. "It sounds different," he said. "That's what right sounds like," Elena told him. Ray pushed off the wall and went back to finish plating the casserole. I stood in the hallway and felt the warmth moving through my house, which I had paid off 12 years ago, one grinding winter at a time, and something inside me unclenched that I hadn't realized was holding. We sat down to eat around 8 o'clock. Ray's sweet potato casserole was exactly what it always was, heavy with butter and brown sugar, the kind of food that didn't apologize for what it was. Leo ate with the focused intensity of a boy who'd skipped lunch. Elena kept refilling his glass of water without being asked, a small automatic gesture that said more about who she was than anything else could have. Ray was telling Leo about the time he'd accidentally rebuilt a carburetor backwards and driven 3 miles before noticing when my phone lit up on the table. Tyler Briggs. The name glowed white against the dark screen. It buzzed once, twice. Ray stopped talking mid-sentence. Not pointedly, just the natural pause of a man who understood that something had shifted in the room. Leo looked at the phone. Elena looked at her plate. The phone buzzed a 3rd time. My heart hammered against my sternum, hard, physical, the kind of heartbeat you feel in your back teeth. 26 years. 26 years of picking up before the 2nd ring, of cutting meetings short and pulling over on icy roads and waking up from dead sleep because Tyler's name was on the screen and you never ever knew if this was the ordinary call or the one that wasn't. The phone buzzed a 4th time. I turned it face down on the table. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every year I'd picked up, full of this morning's phone call in the baking aisle, full of Chloe's voice saying we feel so much lighter. Ray picked up his fork and finished his sentence about the carburetor like nothing had happened. Leo laughed at the punchline. Elena reached across and refilled my water glass this time. I picked up my fork and ate. By 9:30, Leo was losing his battle with sleep. He made it back to the couch under his own power, pulled the quilt down from the back cushion by himself, and was unconscious within 4 minutes of horizontal. His mouth fell open slightly. One arm dropped off the edge of the cushion. Ray stood up, put on his coat, and paused at the door. He looked at me for a long moment, that carved, weathered face, doing the thing it did when Ray had something to say, but had decided the time for saying it wasn't right now. He squeezed my shoulder once hard, the way men of his generation express the things they were never taught words for. Then he left. Elena washed the dishes without being asked. I dried them. We worked side by side in the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable because it's built on the right foundation. "You should get some sleep before your contracts," she said, stacking the last plate. "I've got a couple hours yet." She nodded. Then carefully, like she was placing something fragile on a shelf. "He called 4 times. "I know." "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay. Not a judgment, not a reassurance. Just an acknowledgement that she had seen it and it was mine to carry, however I needed to carry it." I pulled my work jacket off the hook. The diesel and rock salt smell hit me, the smell Chloe had called embarrassing, the smell of 26 years of showing up. I put it on. The snow was coming down in the kind of thick, wet sheets that don't care about your wipers or your headlights or your opinion of them. I backed the plow truck out of the driveway at 10:40 and pointed it north, and the weight of the blade on the front felt the way it always felt, solid, purposeful, like having an answer to a question the road was asking. I have driven these streets in worse. February of 2019, the temperature hit 4 below and 3 of my competitors called their clients and canceled. I didn't cancel. You don't build a 26-year business in a mountain town by canceling on people when the weather gets serious. The weather getting serious is precisely when you show up. My first stop was Dorothy Anderson's place on Clearwater Drive. Dorothy was 78 years old and had lived in the same house for 51 years. Her husband Harold had died 14 months ago, and she had spent the first winter without him learning, at 77, how to manage a property alone. She'd called me in September to renew her contract, and her voice had been very steady and very careful in the way voices get when a person is holding themselves together through sheer deliberate effort. I cleared her driveway and her front walk and the path to her garage. The porch light came on while I was finishing the walk, and Dorothy opened the front door in her bathrobe and slippers, a mug of something hot in both hands. "Hazel." Her voice cracked on the single word, warm and relieved. "You came out in this." "I always come, Mrs. Anderson." "I have cocoa," she said. "Come in for just a minute, please." I looked at my watch. I had 5 more stops. The snow wasn't slowing down. "Next time," I told her, "you go back inside before you freeze. Lock up." She pressed her hand flat against her chest and nodded that gesture people make when words aren't quite sufficient. I watched her door close before I got back in the truck. I sat there for a moment in the cab with the engine running and the defroster blowing. I always come. I had said those words to Dorothy Anderson and meant them completely. She was on my contract list. She had paid me for this service. She was 78 years old and alone, and she needed her driveway clear so she could get to her doctor on Thursday. That was what a contract meant. You showed up because you said you would, and because the person on the other end of the agreement was counting on you, and because your word was the only currency that didn't lose value in a bad economy. I worked through the list. Stop 2, stop 3, stop 4. The snow accumulated faster than I could move it. In some places I doubled back twice on the steeper grades. By midnight, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees, and the whole town felt like it had been sealed under glass. Stop 5 was on Ridgeline Court 4 blocks from Tyler Street. I turned onto the access road and my headlights swept across the intersection. To the left was Ridgeline Court and Mr. Hafner's double driveway, which was going to take me 20 minutes in this accumulation. To the right, 3 blocks down and 1 block over, was the house where my son was sitting in the dark. I knew without driving past that the driveway would be buried. I knew without checking that Tyler didn't own a snowblower. He'd borrowed mine twice and returned it once, with a bent auger housing that he'd never mentioned and I'd never brought up. I knew that the sedan in his garage had summer tires. I knew all of this the way you know the contents of a house you built with your own hands. I had 6 contracts tonight. Tyler's driveway was not one of them. Had never been one of them. What it had been for 6 years was something I did because I drove past anyway, and it seemed easier than explaining why I hadn't. I turned left onto Ridgeline Court. The plow blade bit into the snow, and I focused on Mr. Hafner's driveway, and I did not look in my rearview mirror. I finished my last stop at 1:10 in the morning. The snow had thinned to a dry sifting by then, the kind that comes after the main event has passed. I drove home through streets that were quieter than any streets have a right to be on Christmas morning, and I thought about Dorothy Anderson pressing her hand to her chest, and about the word contract, and about what it meant to make a promise, and keep it even when keeping it cost you something. My porch light was still on when I pulled in. Inside the furnace hummed steady and clean Elena's work, holding through the night. The kitchen light was on low. Elena sat at the table with a mug of tea gone cold, her phone charging on the counter, her eyes tracking to me when I came through the door. She looked at my face and didn't ask how it went. "Leo's on the couch," she said quietly. He tried to wait up. I walked to the living room doorway. Leo was curled under the quilt, one arm hanging off the cushion edge, his mouth slightly open the way children sleep when they've finally stopped guarding themselves. Spread across his lap was the piece of paper he'd been drawing on earlier, the paper napkin from dinner covered in pencil marks I couldn't quite make out in the low light. He'd fallen asleep mid-drawing. I stood in the doorway in my work jacket that smelled like diesel and rock salt in winter, and something moved through my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. Not sadness, not relief. Something older than both of those. The feeling of recognizing in the dark and quiet of 1 in the morning that love doesn't stop being real just because it ends up in an unexpected place. My eyes burned. I let them. I pulled the quilt up over Leo's hanging arm. He didn't stir. When I came back to the kitchen, Elena was standing at the counter pouring the cold tea down the drain. She filled the kettle without being asked and set it on the burner. "He drew something," I said. "On the napkin." I couldn't see it clearly. "He wouldn't show me either," Elena said. "He said it wasn't finished." The kettle began to tick as the water heated. Outside, the snow had stopped entirely. The silence it left behind was the particular silence of a town that has been thoroughly buried and is now just sitting with it. My phone buzzed on the counter. An unknown number it had called once earlier that evening while I was out at the shed. I'd let it go to voicemail then. Now I stared at the screen for a second, turned it face up and answered. The woman on the phone had introduced herself as Karen. She worked the overnight desk at Riverside Urgent Care on Galveston Avenue, and she'd found my name on the community board at Harding's Hardware, the corkboard by the front register, where people tacked business cards and hand-lettered flyers and the occasional lost dog notice, Hazel's yard and snow service, equipment maintenance, emergency calls. She'd apologized for the hour. I told her to keep the waiting room doors closed to hold in whatever heat was left, and that if the system got worse, she should call back. She called back at 6:47. I was already near the surface of sleep by then, that particular hovering state that comes after 4 hours of broken rest when your body has spent 26 winters learning that full unconsciousness is a luxury you don't always get to keep. The phone rang once, and I was sitting up before the second ring finished. I went to the guest room door and knocked twice. Elena. The door opened in 11 seconds. She was already dressed work pants, thermal underlayer hair pulled back. Behind her, Leo sat up on the air mattress we'd pulled from the hall closet, one side of his hair completely flat, blinking at me with the dazed expression of a child yanked out of the deepest part of sleep. "What's happening?" he asked. "Heating system down at the urgent care clinic on Galveston," I said. "Patients in the waiting room." Leo threw back his blanket and reached for his socks. "I'm coming." Elena looked at me over his head, one eyebrow raised slightly. "Bundle up," I told him. "It's 17 degrees and the wind hasn't quit." He pulled on 2 pairs of socks without being asked. The roads had the particular cruelty of post-storm mornings. The snow itself had stopped. The sky had gone clear and brutally cold, and the surface melt from the previous afternoon had refrozen overnight into a glaze so smooth it looked almost decorative. I drove Elena's van. Ray had gone out to Ridley's after midnight with his jumper pack, got it running, and driven it back to my driveway. He put chains on it too, and they were still seated and biting in the frozen ruts, and Elena sat in the passenger seat with a thermal mug of coffee I'd poured too fast, running diagnostics out loud the way she apparently did when she was working through a problem. If it's the inducer motor, I've got a spare that might fit, depends on the make. Heat exchanger failure is less likely given the timeline she described, but I won't rule it out until I see it. She turned the mug in both hands. Pressure relief valve seized from the temperature drop is my first guess. Thermal expansion overnight valve can't release system shuts itself down as a safety measure. You think you can fix it on site? If it's the valve, yes. 20 minutes, maybe less. She looked out the window at the white-coated road. "What year's the building?" 92, maybe a year or two earlier. Then we're almost certainly looking at original equipment. She nodded, once deciding something internally. "I've got what I need." In the back seat, Leo had pressed his forehead against the cold window glass and was watching the dark storefronts go by the bakery with its Merry Christmas sign in the window, the hardware store where my name was on the corkboard, the gas station lit up yellow in the gray morning like a lantern somebody left on. "Miss Hazel," he said, without turning from the window. "Do you do this every Christmas?" "Do what? Go out when everyone else stays in." I thought about Dorothy Anderson's porch light the night before, about 6 contracts and a town that needed its roads clear and its walkways safe even on the days it would rather be inside with its family. "Pretty much," I said. He considered this. "I think that's a good thing to be," he said, still looking at the storefronts, "the person who goes out." My chest did something complicated that I didn't have a clean word for. The Riverside Urgent Care was a single-story beige building behind a parking lot that somebody had plowed adequately. Not well the kind of job that gets done when the operator's mind is already somewhere warmer. 6 cars, all the interior lights on. Through the glass front doors, I could see people in their coats sitting in the waiting room chairs, breath faintly visible in the cold air. Karen was at the door before we reached it, a woman in her mid-40s, stethoscope still looped around her neck, the particular taut alertness of someone who has been managing a crisis since midnight, on willpower alone. She looked at Elena's tool bag, and something in her shoulders physically dropped. "I called 3 contractors," she said, her voice tight with exhausted relief. 3, nobody's coming out on Christmas morning." "We're here now," Elena said. "Show me the mechanical room." Karen led her back without another word. Leo and I settled into the waiting room. 4 patients, an older man with his right wrist wrapped in an elastic bandage, a young mother with a feverish toddler pressed against her chest, and 2 others sitting quietly in their coats. The room was cold enough that every exhaled breath showed as a small white cloud. Leo sat down in the empty chair beside the older man. He looked at the wrapped wrist with the open curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring requires apology. "Does it hurt?" he asked. The man looked down at him surprised. He was somewhere in his 70s, white-haired, wearing a canvas jacket that had seen better decades. "Some," he said. "Slipped on my back steps this morning. Heard it pop." Leo winced in genuine sympathy. "That's a bad sound." "Worst kind." The man shifted in his chair. "You here with her?" He nodded toward the direction Elena had disappeared. "She's my mom," Leo said. "She fixes heating systems. She's really good at it." "That's so." The man looked at me. I nodded. "Our van battery died in the snow yesterday." Leo continued conversationally as if he were catching up an old friend on recent developments. "In the parking lot at Ridley's, Ms. Hazel found us and helped us out." He paused. "Now Mom's fixing the heater here." The man looked at me again longer this time. "You Hazel Briggs from the snow service?" "I am." He extended his good hand. "Tom Weatherby. You plowed my sister's driveway on Clearwater Drive for 11 years. She talks about you every winter." I shook his hand carefully, mindful of his wrapped wrist. "How is she?" "Stubborn as always," he said, and smiled for the first time since we'd walked in. Which I mean as the highest compliment. Leo, satisfied that the social infrastructure was now properly established, folded his hands in his lap and addressed Tom Weatherby. "Do you know if birds ever slip on ice?" Tom Weatherby blinked. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, that is an excellent question," and the 2 of them were off. Elena came out of the mechanical room 18 minutes after she went in. She was wiping her hands on a shop rag, and Karen was 2 steps behind her, with the expression of a woman who has just been told the surgery went perfectly and the patient is asking for lunch. "Pressure relief valve," Elena said to me. "Seized up from the temperature drop overnight. Thermal expansion pushed it past the tolerance point. I cleared it, ran it through 2 full cycles to confirm, checked the secondary exchanger while I was in there." She tucked the shop rag into her back pocket. "You're going to want a budget for a full system inspection in the spring. This equipment is tired." Karen put both hands over her mouth. Her eyes went bright and glassy, and she blinked hard 3 fast times, the involuntary response of someone trying very hard not to cry at the front desk of a medical facility on Christmas morning. "What do I owe you?" she managed. Elena looked at me. "Nothing," I said. "Merry Christmas." Karen made a sound that was mostly breath. She disappeared into the back hallway and came out 2 minutes later, carrying a large stockpot of chicken soup in both arms and a foil tray of biscuits balanced on top. The staff breakfast, from the look of it, still warm. "Please," she said. "I mean it. Please take it." We drove home with the soup wedged carefully between Leo's feet in the back seat, the heater running full, the van smelling like chicken broth, and the pine air freshener Elena had hanging from the rearview mirror. Leo spent most of the drive giving Elena a detailed account of his conversation with Tom Weatherby, which had apparently covered ice gravity bird anatomy and the structural engineering of pine branches, before Karen had come back out to tell them the heat was restored. "He said he'd never seen a bird fall off a branch," Leo reported. "But then he said he'd never actually watched to see, so we don't really know." "That's most of science," Elena said. "That's what he said too." Leo sounded deeply satisfied by this convergence. I turned onto my street. My porch light was still on that small square of amber, burning exactly where I'd left it. After everything this night had pulled out of me, seeing it didn't feel like habit anymore. It felt like a promise I'd made to myself a long time ago and had somehow managed to keep. Elena checked the outdoor pipes while I carried the soup inside and set it on the stove. I watched her through the kitchen window, moving along the foundation with her flashlight, crouching to examine the joints, pressing 2 fingers against the pipe surface at each connection point. This woman I had known for less than a full day, inspecting the bones of my house, with the careful attention of someone who understood that the difference between a small problem and a catastrophic one was usually just timing and a flashlight. She came back through the side door, boots heavy with snow, pulling her gloves off 1 finger at a time. North side had a section under expansion stress, she said, dropping her gloves on the counter. Another hour in this cold and it would have split. I bled, the line pressures equalized, you're solid now. She looked at me steadily. Anyone who had exposed pipe runs last night and didn't check them this morning is going to find water where they didn't want it. She said it the way tradespeople say true things, without drama, without accusation. The flat, declarative tone of someone describing physics rather than passing judgment. I thought about the garage foundation at Tyler's house. The section of pipe along the north wall that I had wrapped in heat tape the winter before last because Tyler had mentioned it was sweating and then forgotten about it entirely. I had not been there last night. I had not checked it. I poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of Elena without comment. The furnace ran steady and clean through the kitchen floor registers, Elena's work from last night, holding through the cold without complaint. Leo came in from the living room holding something small and folded, carrying it flat in both palms, the way you carry something you've decided is important. The paper napkin, the one he'd been working on at dinner, the one he'd fallen asleep over on the couch, the one I'd noticed but couldn't see clearly in the dark. He'd finished it. Sometime between last night and this morning, he'd finished it. He looked at me, not at Elena, directly at me, with those careful eyes that had been measuring the world since long before a 9-year-old should have needed to. "Can I give it to you later?" he asked. His voice was serious the way children are serious about things that matter to them. "When everyone's here." I looked at the folded napkin in his hands, at the deliberate way he was holding it, at the expression on his face that said this was not a small thing to him, that he had thought about the right moment for it, and decided that this was not yet that moment. "We'll wait," I said. He nodded, relieved. I thought that I hadn't pushed and carried it back to the living room with the same careful 2-handed grip. A minute later, I heard him settle back onto the couch. Elena wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and looked at me across the kitchen counter. "He worked on that all night," she said quietly. "He woke up twice. I heard him." My throat tightened around something I didn't try to name. Outside, the Christmas morning sun was coming up properly now, low and brilliant, flooding off the snow in every direction, the kind of light that makes the whole world look like it's been freshly made. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed. A child's voice, high and delighted, carried across the cold air. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Ray. On my way over, making room for more people, I typed back, "Doors open." I set the phone down and listened to the furnace run and the street come slowly to life outside my window and Leo turn a page in the living room, and I thought that whatever was coming next, this kitchen this morning, this particular quality of light, this was already something. Before I reveal what was on that napkin and who came walking through the snow to my front door, drop the word cake in the comments so I know you're still with me. What happens next is the moment this whole story has been building toward. Just so you know, this story includes some fictional elements woven in for depth and meaning. If you'd rather not continue, this is a perfectly good place to pause. But something tells me you're staying. True to his word, Leo set the folded napkin carefully on the end table beside the couch, like a boy who understood that some things had a designated time and place. He picked up his book and waited patiently, showing a kind of maturity most adults spend a lifetime trying to learn. Ray showed up at 10:30 with a plate of Christmas cookies his neighbor Mrs. Fielding sent over every year without fail, sugar cookies with red and green frosting, the kind so sweet they made your back teeth ache. He set them on the kitchen table and looked at the pot of chicken soup on the stove and nodded approvingly. Urgent care, he guessed. They were down to 38 degrees in the waiting room, I said. And you just happen to have an HVAC tech on the premises. He poured himself a coffee without asking because Ray had never needed to ask in my kitchen. Funny how that works. By 11, Carl Dietrich had stopped by my mechanic for going on 9 years, a quiet man with permanently grease-stained knuckles, who had kept both my plow trucks running through conditions that should have finished them. He'd heard from Karen at the urgent care, he said, who'd told the story to her husband, who'd told Carl at the gas station when Carl stopped for coffee at 7 that morning. Small towns in Oregon work like that. Information travels faster than vehicles. Carl shook Elena's hand and asked her 3 technical questions about the pressure relief valve repair, and the way Elena answered them precise. No hedging. No deference made Carl look at me over her shoulder with an expression that said plainly, "Where did you find this one?" The living room filled up gradually the way houses fill on holidays when the door keeps opening and nobody quite decides to leave. Ray and Carl at the kitchen table. 2 nurses from the urgent care who'd finished their morning shift and stopped in to say thank you properly, still in their scrubs under their coats. Old Mr. Peterson, from the end of the block, who'd seen the lights on and knocked because he hadn't seen this many cars on my street since Harold Anderson's funeral. I had not planned any of this. It was happening the way good things sometimes happen, because you did the right thing and the right thing turned out to be connected to other right things in ways you couldn't have mapped in advance. Elena was laughing at something Carl said. Leo was showing Mr. Peterson a card trick he'd apparently learned from the man at the urgent care waiting room. The soup was warm on the stove, and the furnace was running clean and steady, and the whole house smelled like coffee and biscuits and the pine wreath I'd hung on the door in November and forgotten about. I was refilling the coffee pot when I heard the sound on the porch. Heavy footsteps, slow. The particular cadence of people who have been walking through deep snow for longer than they expected. I looked out the kitchen window. Tyler and Chloe were coming up my front walk. Tyler was in his good winter coat, the charcoal wool one entirely wrong for the conditions, soaked dark along the hem and both sleeves where he'd been breaking through the crusted snow. Chloe was beside him in her white parka, the one she'd paid $380 for last February, now ringed at the bottom with a gray tide line of road salt and slush. Her hair, which she maintained with the kind of vigilance that required monthly appointments, was flattened under a knit hat pulled low. Neither of them had proper snow boots on. They'd walked. I didn't know from how far, but they'd walked. I set the coffee pot down. The room behind me had gone different, not quiet, but aware. Ray had stopped talking. I heard Carl set his mug down on the table. I went to the front door and opened it before they knocked. Tyler looked at me. His face was doing something complicated. Cold, reddened jaw, tight, the particular expression of a man who has spent a long walk rehearsing words and arrived to find them insufficient. Behind him, Chloe's eyes swept the room over my shoulder. All those people, the soup, the cookies, the nurses still in their scrubs, Ray at my kitchen table like he owned a piece of it. Her face went very still. "Come in," I said. "Get warm." They stepped inside. The room absorbed them the way a room absorbs an awkward thing, with the minor adjustment of people shifting in their chairs and finding somewhere else to look for a moment. Leo came out of the living room. He walked past Tyler. He walked past Chloe. He came straight to me, and he held out the folded napkin with both hands, and he said, "Everyone's here now, Ms. Hazel." I took it from him. I unfolded it. Leo had drawn it in pencil. Careful, deliberate lines that a 9-year-old makes when they are trying very hard to get something right. A woman behind the wheel of a large truck, a plow blade visible at the front, and behind her radiating outward from her shoulders in lines that he'd pressed hard enough to indent the paper light. Not a halo, just light, the kind you draw when you want to show that something is the source of something. Underneath, in the careful block letters of a child who takes spelling seriously, "This is you. You are our Christmas hero, Leo." My throat closed completely. My eyes burned so fast I didn't have time to brace for it, and I felt the tears come before I could make any decision about them, hot and sudden on my face, in front of Ray and Carl and the nurses and Mr. Peterson and my son and my daughter-in-law and everyone. I did not try to stop them. Ray started clapping, one slow clap, then another. Carl joined. The nurses. Mr. Peterson, who didn't fully know the story but understood the room. I crouched down in front of Leo and looked at him straight on. His eyes were wide and a little worried, the way a child's eyes go when they've done something that made a grown-up cry, and they're not sure if that was the right outcome. "It's exactly right," I told him, and my voice only broke on the last word. "It's exactly right." He threw his arms around my neck and squeezed with the full-body commitment that children bring to hugs, and I held on and let my eyes close for just a moment. When I straightened up, I looked at Tyler. He was staring at the napkin in my hand, at the drawing, at the lines of light radiating out from the woman behind the wheel. His jaw worked. His eyes were red at the corners and getting redder. "Mom," he said. Just that. Just the word cracked down the middle. "I know," I said. "Come sit down." The living room cleared out gradually. Ray herded people toward the door with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that some conversations needed fewer witnesses. Carl shook my hand on the way out. The nurses hugged me, which surprised me enough that I hugged them back. Mr. Peterson patted Leo on the head and told him the card trick needed work, which Leo accepted as legitimate feedback. When the door closed behind the last of them, it was just the 6 of us. Me, Tyler, Chloe, Elena, Leo, and Ray, who had not left, because Ray never left when there was still something that needed finishing. Tyler sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. His coat was still damp at the shoulders. Chloe sat beside him, straight-backed her white parka, unzipped the salt stains on the hem visible from across the room. She hadn't spoken since she walked in. I sat down across from my son. "Tell me," I said. He told me. The power had gone out before 5 o'clock the night before. The generator he'd been counting on, he stopped there, looked at the table, and kept going. No heat after midnight when the gas furnace lost its blower circuit. His mother-in-law in 3 layers of clothing on the couch. The pipe in the garage foundation that had let go sometime before dawn, he'd heard it go, a sound like a gunshot from the basement, and come downstairs to find water spreading across the concrete floor and working its way toward the carpet. He'd tried to drive for a pump. The sedan had spun out on the driveway before he made it to the street. He stopped talking. He looked at his coffee mug. His jaw was working the way jaws work when a man is trying to keep his face from doing something he doesn't want it to do in front of people. "The rug," Chloe said suddenly. Her voice was strange, flat, and airless, like something had gone out of it. "The one I told you not to." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled up fast and hot, and she blinked hard once, twice, a third time. "It's ruined." The room held its breath. I looked at Chloe. Really looked at her maybe for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. Underneath the expensive parka and the careful hair now flattened by a wool hat, she was 28 years old, and she was sitting in her mother-in-law's kitchen on Christmas Day with wet shoes and no plan, and the specific devastation of someone who has just watched the version of their life they'd been building come apart in a single night. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired in a way that went all the way down. I stood up and went to the counter drawer, the one where I kept the things I needed to be able to find quickly: contractor numbers, supplier contacts, the business cards I'd collected over 26 years of knowing who to call when something broke and you couldn't fix it yourself. I pulled out 3 cards and set them on the table in front of Tyler, one at a time. "Plumber," I said. "Emergency holiday rate, but they're fast and they're honest. Tell them the pipe location and they'll know what you need." I set down the second card. "Tow and recovery. They handle driveways, not just roads. Mention the sedan on an incline." The third card. "Snow removal. Commercial operation, so the rate's higher, but they've got the equipment for what's on your driveway right now." Tyler stared at the 3 cards lined up in front of him like he was reading a sentence he needed a moment to translate. "Call them," I said. "Tell them what happened. Pay them. You know how to do all of that." His eyes came up to mine. They were red-rimmed and very direct, and I saw in them something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the practiced casualness of a man who had learned to take things for granted, but something younger than that. something that remembered being 6 years old. Mom. His voice broke on the word again, but differently this time, not the cracked single syllable from before, but something fuller, something that was trying to become a sentence. I didn't understand what you were. I know you didn't, I said, not unkindly, just true. Chloe put her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once hard, and then she pulled them back and straightened up and breathed out through her nose. She looked at me with eyes that were wet and unguarded in a way I had never seen from her before. I said something yesterday, she started. You did, I said. I heard it, and I think if you're honest with yourself, you've known for a while that it wasn't right. I paused. We don't have to settle everything today, but we do have to start being honest about what this has been. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the afternoon light was coming in low and golden through the window above the sink, the particular slant of winter sun that only shows up when the snow has stopped and the sky has gone clear, and everything outside is white and still and lit from the side like something in a painting. Tyler picked up the 3 business cards. He held them in both hands, looking at them the way you look at something simple that turns out to contain more information than you expected. He nodded. Once. Then he stood up. I walked them to the door. On the porch, Tyler turned around, and for a moment he just looked at me, his face open in a way that cost him something, standing there in the cold with his damp wool coat and his 3 business cards, and the particular posture of a man who has just been handed back the weight of his own life. I'll call you, he said. I know you will, I said. And I meant it. Chloe looked at me over Tyler's shoulder. Her eyes were still bright. She didn't say anything, but she held my gaze for a full 3 seconds before she turned and followed Tyler down the steps, carefully, one hand on the railing, watching for ice. I watched them go until they reached the end of the block. Then I came back inside and closed the door. I turned to Elena. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with Leo beside her, his shoulder pressed against her hip, watching me with those careful eyes that missed nothing. The attic room, I said. It's got its own entrance off the side stairs and its own bathroom. I had it painted last spring and never did anything with it. I looked at Elena steadily. The job is full-time. Equipment maintenance service calls when I need a second set of hands, snow season starting immediately. Fair hourly rate, and we'll put something simple in writing so you're protected. Oregon landlord-tenant straightforward. I paused. The work is steady and the roof is solid, and I won't pretend I don't need the help. Elena looked at Leo. Leo looked at me and said, Can I have the room with the window? It's the only room, I told him. Then yes, he said. Elena's mouth curved, not a big smile, just the quiet kind, the kind that means something has landed exactly where it was supposed to. She put her hand out, and I shook it the same firm grip as the parking lot yesterday, which felt like a very long time ago, and also like this morning. Ray appeared from behind her with the chocolate Yule log cake from the counter, the one I'd bought at Ridley's yesterday for a table that didn't want me, the one Leo had carried from the parking lot to the truck, to the house with the reverence of someone transporting something sacred. Somebody going to cut this thing, Ray said, or are we just going to look at it? Leo pulled out a chair and climbed up on his knees and said, I'll get the knife, in the tone of someone who has been waiting for this moment since the beginning. I sat down. My chair in my kitchen, in my house at a table that had more people around it who wanted me there than it had seen in longer than I could honestly remember. Ray set the cake in the center of the table. The afternoon light caught the dark chocolate glaze and the little ridge of powdered sugar along the top. Simple, exactly what it was. Leo found the knife in the third drawer he tried, held it up in triumph and grinned at me across the table with chocolate smudge anticipation and the unguarded joy of a child who has stopped bracing for disappointment. I thought about yesterday, the baking aisle, the phone call, the parking lot where I'd sat in my truck and asked myself for the first time in 26 years who I was actually showing up for. It turned out the answer was still out there. It had just needed a snowstorm and a dead battery and a boy with worn-through sneakers to make itself findable. All right, I said. Cut the cake. I spent 63 years believing love meant never stopping, never saying enough. I think God was showing me something I refused to see, that love without boundaries isn't devotion. It's slow disappearance. This family drama was my life. I'm not proud of every chapter. I enabled Tyler for 32 years and called it motherhood. Don't do what I did. Don't wait for a snowstorm to show you who actually wants you at the table. The woman who keeps showing up for everyone else deserves someone who shows up for her. The best revenge stories with mom aren't about anger. They're about the moment a woman decides her dignity matters more than someone else's comfort. These revenge stories with mom begin with exhaustion, not fury. One parking lot, one child who wasn't sure kindness was real. That was my turning point. Every family drama asks the same question: how long will you wait before choosing yourself? I waited 63 years. I hope you don't. If these revenge stories with mom hit something deep in you, comment below, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. Stories on this channel include fictional elements created for reflection and meaningful conversation. If this isn't the right fit for you, we respect that. But if you stayed this long, something here was meant for you.